Hey, Bio Report listeners. Last week, we released an additional episode of the podcast that featured the Himalayan Cataract Project, which is working to eradicate preventable blindness throughout the world. There are 18 million people in the developing world who are unable to perform the task of daily living because of easily treatable cataracts that can be addressed with a fast and inexpensive procedure. We're helping to raise $100,000 through a GoFundMe campaign to bring the organization back to Ethiopia and Eritrea, where on a recent trip to the region, they performed 4,300 sight-saving surgeries. If you'd like to learn more, have a listen to the special episode in our feed. We'll include a link at the bottom of this week's episode to the campaign. Thanks to all who gave, and if you haven't, we encourage you to consider making a donation to the cause. I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. A holiday tradition at the Bio Report is to take a moment to reflect on the year past and look ahead to the new year with Adam Feuerstein, senior writer and national biotech columnist for STAT. We talked to Feuerstein about some of the highs and lows of the year in biotech, a few of the big stories he followed, and the big fourth quarter for biotech stocks. Feuerstein offers us a look at the best and worst CEO of 2019, the upcoming JPMorgan conference, and what to watch in 2020. Adam, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Danny. I feel like this is like a holiday tradition for the
It
two of
is
us
indeed.
to get together and talk about the new year.
Unlike making cheesecake with goat cheese.
Now, I didn't make it with goat cheese.
I know.
It was
goat
cheesecake, the greatest of all time.
Yes,
There was a little confusion on Twitter.
I have access to Urban Dictionary. So we're going to talk about the year that was in biotech, touch on some highlights, and look at what's ahead for the industry in 2020 at JPMorgan and beyond. Some of the financial numbers are down from a year ago, but overall it was a big year for biotech, and various indices are up 35 to 40%, thanks largely to activity in the fourth quarter. How do you think about 2019? What kind of a year was it overall?
Yeah, I mean, if you do want to start with kind of with the stock, like anyone we spoke, the sector was in the dumps, right? I mean, December of 2018 was a horrible time. Basically, all the biotech indices were crashing down, and then the the Bristol Myers Celgene deal was announced right at the end of the year, and that sort of rallied stocks higher going into January. So if you look at 2019, there really wasn't very much headway one way or the other made through pretty much all of the year. The stocks were kind of trading sideways for a long time. They were underperforming the S&P, and then basically in the beginning of October, biotech stocks took off. So if you really look at the gains that were made, and it's a great year. I mean, stocks are, if you look at a 1 year performance, the XBI, which is kind of the index that I look at mostly, it's up about 49% over the last year, and pretty much all those gains are from October until the present.
It was another strong year for drug approvals, 49 as of December 20th. Less than in 2018, but some very significant approvals nonetheless. Vertex cystic fibrosis, triple combination therapy, a life-changing and disease-changing therapy won approval. How significant do you see this? And does it say anything about the types of therapeutic payoffs we're seeing and may see in the next few years?
Yeah, I would say if you look at you mentioned Trikafta, the Vertex CF drug, that was probably, I would say, up there on the top of sort of the most important, most meaningful drugs approved This year, now Vertex has drugs that can address about 90% of the mutations that cause CF. The other big one this year was Zolgensma, the gene therapy from Novartis, which treats spinal muscular atrophy, the very rare inherited fatal disease that afflicts children. Those probably were the two drugs that sort of at the top of my list, sort of notable approvals. The other big thing, big trend certainly towards the end of the year was the FDA approving drugs early. Trikafta was approved months ahead of schedule. There were a bunch of drugs at the end of the year that we were all waiting for 2020 for the approval decisions, and they all came early. It seems like the FDA sort of dipped ahead into next year, into the well next year to approve new drugs.
On the drug development front, I think one of the most surprising stories has been Biogen and its failed and then revived Alzheimer's drug. What happened and how is this being viewed? And when do you think there may be clarity on it?
Yeah, well, that was definitely one of the bigger and more shocking stories of 2019. We had all thought that Biogen's Alzheimer's drug, aducanumab, was kind of put on the shelf because initially the company came out and said the studies had failed the futility analysis, and then months later we find out that, well, lo and behold, they did some more analyses. They looked at some longer term data at a higher dose, and they found what they describe as a significant and meaningful benefit for Alzheimer's patients, and now they're going to file that drug with the FDA, and so that will be a very big story kind of into 2020. Again, depending on when they file. I mean, they're going to file early 2020, so the first thing everyone will look to is to see whether the FDA accepts that application and what kind of review it gets. And then, maybe towards the end of 2020, in the back half of 2020, there could be an FDA advisory panel that will review that drug. So yeah, that's definitely be a big story for 2020.
How much skepticism is there about that?
Oh, there's a lot of skepticism. Yeah, I mean, when the data were presented recently, I think that there's a lot of people who sort of look at it objectively and just do not see the benefit for this drug that Biogen claims there is. On the other side, as you mentioned, and as we mentioned, the FDA seems to be very flexible and very willing, eager to approve drugs, even with data that are, somewhat mixed, let's say. And so, there could be a lot of pressure on the agency to approve an Alzheimer's drug, a disease where there basically are no really good, effective treatment options for patients suffering from that disease. So, that's going to be sort of a push and pull there. Do you go with straight data, or do you say, look, this offers a little bit of hope for patients, maybe a tiny little bit of benefit, and then we approve it. So, that's a drug that's just going to be widely debated throughout the year.
A company we've talked about in the past is Amarin, which again has been in the news for its fish oil pill, which won expanded approval and now carries the claim that it prevents heart attacks, strokes, and other related health problems in people with cardiovascular risk. It wasn't the full-blown claim the company was seeking, but a win nonetheless. How significant a victory was it given the history of this drug, and what will it mean to Amarin?
Well, yeah, from a sort of very high level, it was a significant victory for Amarin, and they got most of what they wanted out of the expanded label for Vascepa, and it's a very large market. So now it's up to the company to sort of make good on that label and commercialize the drug and sell it, and sort of and generate the kind of the billions of dollars in sales that people expect that drug to deliver. And I think it brings up an interesting something that I'm watching, or one of my sort of big trends for 2020 will be drug launches. I think there's some significant drug launches that we will watch in 2020, and I'll run off a list here for you. You've got Intercept Pharmaceuticals, which should get their NASH drug approved. It will be the first drug approved to treat NASH So watching how that drug does commercially will be really important. You've got Aimmune with a peanut allergy, the peanut allergy therapy, preventative therapy. Again, that will be one I think will be really interesting to watch. You mentioned Amarin. That one will be good. Global Blood Therapeutics, just got their sickle cell disease drug approved at the end of the year, so I think people will be watching to see how that drug does on the market. And then, again, we mentioned Vertex and Trikafta, their new CF drug, and so that will also be a commercial launch to watch.
One other drug you raised earlier, the Novartis gene therapy, Zolgensma for SMA. This had its launch. It's a potentially curative treatment for the condition. Have we learned anything about the commercial life of these therapies, and how has that launch gone?
Well, initially, I think that the initial numbers coming out of Zolgensma from sales-wise were actually really good. And, that sometimes that's a little bit misleading because you have patients who are kind of sort of warehoused or sort of ready and to go on the therapy. I think we'll sort of have to see how that plays out and sort of how strong over the next few quarters that drug does. And the bigger issue there is probably the reimbursement. And it is the most expensive medicine today. And I think it will be. We have to sort of see how insurance companies handle that, how reimbursement goes. Obviously it's a rare disease, so you're not talking about a ton of patients. But I think just generally, as we get more of these gene therapies, and this is, not necessarily like a 2019 story, because it's been, one for the last few years, and it will be into 2020 and beyond, is just kind of how these very, very expensive gene therapies, once they are approved, how well they do commercially, how insurance companies handle them. Companies are taking on sort of different strategies on how to sort of ameliorate the high cost, and we'll just see how those play out.
As part of your annual tradition, you poll readers on the very best and worst CEOs on a list of nominees. Alnylam CEO won for the second time in 3 years. I think he's gonna be retired from the award now, because he's won it twice. John Maraganore from Alnylam was one of my nominees for best CEO of the year, and then when I put it to a vote among my readers at Stat, they sort of picked him among as the number one guy. And again, I think RNA was RNA interference was a sort of big year for it for the entire field. Certainly for Alnylam, had a second drug approved. A third RNAi drug from their pipeline looks on its way to being approved. And then there was just a lot of good deal. There was a lot of good deal flow out of sort of the RNAi field. Most notably, the medicines company being acquired or a deal sort of announced for that. So, if you look kind of the long arc of RNAi, it was something that was really exciting. It won a Nobel Prize years back, and then kind of Big Pharma sort of got out of the field. But now it seems to have sort of definitely sort of entrenched itself as a definite platform and a therapeutic platform, a technology that is definitely benefiting patients. The competition for worst CEO was a tighter fight this year. Biogen's Michael Vounatsos took the dishonor. Why Vounatsos, and what's the challenge ahead for him?
Yeah, so I think it was maybe a little bit, I thought maybe it would have been a little bit of a controversial selection to sort of put the Biogen CEO on the worst list. But it turned out not to be. He won the award, so I guess people agreed that he should not only be on that list, but be the worst CEO of the year. And I think it's not necessarily, obviously it is about aducanumab, but I think it's also about the fact that Biogen finds itself in a position where it is so heavily dependent on the outcome of aducanumab, this incredibly risky drug, and instead of sort of going out and diversifying the company and building a stronger pipeline, maybe making some sort of smaller acquisitions that could have really sort of helped to generate growth outside of Alzheimer's, the company has just really not done that. And I think that's been a kind of perennial disappointment for its shareholders and for other people who watch the company. And that's pretty much the reason that he's on the list. It's not necessarily just because of aducanumab. It's just that so much is riding on this drug that it doesn't really. It's a company that probably could have diversified its risk a little bit better.
Scott Gottlieb left the FDA in 2019. You forget it's been a long year here. It was a short but busy tenure. Will Gottlieb have a lasting legacy? Will he be remembered for anything?
You mean other than tweeting a lot? Yeah, he will. Yes, we joke about Scott's tweets, and then just a week or so ago, his tweets disappeared, and there was a big hubbub about that, and now I guess they've been restored. Yeah, I mean, probably mostly around vaping and e-cigarettes and sort of the whole controversy there. He obviously was very involved and continues to be involved even now that he's not at the FDA. Probably that's where he will be most remembered. He's such a. I sort of feel bad for the FDA commissioners and now Stephen Hahn, who's there, in that Scott Gottlieb just casts a large shadow. Right? He's a very charismatic guy. As we said, he tweeted a lot. Everybody knows him. So it's kind of, and he's still out there. He's very outspoken, and he's still to this day. So it's going to be hard for any FDA commissioner to kind of compete with that.
Well, you mentioned Stephen Hahn. He comes to the agency after serving as chief medical executive at MD Anderson Cancer Center. What does he bring to the FDA, and what's on the top of the agenda for him?
Well, that is a really good question, and Danny, I don't actually know. It's interesting. There's very little that's known about Stephen Hahn. I mean, obviously, he's he comes out of MD Anderson. He's an oncologist. I mean, he has he's obviously a very credible and well qualified individual. But in terms of policies or things that he wants to champion, he's a little bit of a closed book. We don't really know what he's going to do. So I think that if you're looking ahead to 2020, like we want to do here on this in this interview, that's one of the things that we'll be watching, is to kind of see if there are policies he puts in place at the FDA, or if there are subtle or even not so subtle changes in the way the FDA handles certain regulatory matters. That will be something that I think people who watch the FDA will definitely be keeping track of.
It's the time of year when people gather in San Francisco to complain about crowds, the cost of hotel rooms, and San Francisco's homeless problem. It doesn't seem to dissuade people from coming to the JPMorgan annual healthcare conference. Why do they keep coming back?
I think people come back despite all the complaining and the things that you mentioned, which are all things that people do complain about. I think they come back for the connections that people make, and it is a meeting where companies get together. Everyone is in the same place, and deals can be made, or even just introductions can be made that later turn into deals, partnerships, collaborations, and I think that's probably the main reason that people show up in San Francisco for JPMorgan every January. And then we're all just there, and everyone else is just there because they don't want to miss out. So yeah, there's a big FOMO component to it.
What are you going to be watching this year? And give me a big pharma and a big biotech you're most keen to hear from.
I think, we mentioned obviously drug launches is something I want to watch. The FDA we want to watch. I think, obviously, we haven't mentioned kind of M&A, and that's always a perennial topic of fascination and interest in people. It was a really 2019 was a really strong year for M&A. I mean, if you want to kind of cheat a little bit and include the Bristol Celgene deal, which obviously happened at the end of 2000. Right at the end of 2018. It was a big year. I pulled up some figures at Leerink, the investment bank Leerink had some numbers. There were 22 deals greater than $500 million each, which was well above the average, which is about 12 deals per year in 2019. Deal total $230 billion total M&A deals in 2019, which is about 3 times the average over the last 10 years. So it was a really strong year for M&A. So that, naturally that gets everybody's hopes, expectations high for another strong year into 2020. Obviously, we'll see how that goes. But yeah, there was a lot of deals. So that's probably the other big thing we're watching. In terms of companies that I want to hear from among the big cap biotech, I would probably say Gilead is probably the one. This will be Dan O'Day, who's their new CEO. He started last March, so he missed out on all the JPMorgan fun and excitement last year. We're in 2019, so this will be his first time presenting at JPMorgan as the CEO of Gilead. So I think it'll be interesting to hear, and I do expect him to sort of lay out a little bit of a strategic vision for how he sees where he wants to see Gilead go. I mean, he's done some of that already to some extent, but that's also a company that I think people expect to do more deals, right? So maybe we'll get some insight from him during his presentation.
In the theme of M&A, is there a most likely to be acquired company out there you see?
Well, any company I mentioned will not be acquired, so I apologize to the shareholders of that company. I think probably, it's funny, probably the company you hear most, the most buzz about is Unicure, the gene therapy company. Once the deal for Spark Therapeutics with Roche, once that deal closed, cleared all the FTC stuff, that was, Unicure's everyone thinks that's going to be the next gene therapy company to be acquired. So we'll see how that goes. But there's lots of there are a lot of the companies, sort of the old companies, that are always on the list, and there's some new companies. But I would say Unicure is one that everyone hopes and or expects to be acquired.
Every year when we have this discussion, it seems like we're heading into a period where drug pricing is finally going to be a real issue that the legislators deal with. It's an election year. On top of that, are we in for drug pricing reform in 2020?
See, I'm actually really happy, Danny, that we got well into this interview without mentioning politics or drug pricing. So I guess it's inevitable that we have to bring it up. And so, yes, obviously, 2020 is an election year, unless you've, been hiding in a cave. This is not a surprise to anybody. So it will be a big topic of discussion. I think it'll be sort of less of an overhang. There's always thought that, it's going to be a terrible thing for the sector. I think, after the year that we've had, where there's been so much discussion and there's been so many proposals brought, introduced into Congress, to varying degrees of sort of, excitement or lack thereof. It seems like maybe people aren't as worried about it. And maybe that's a good or a bad thing. I don't know. I mean, obviously it will play a role in the election. But one of the things we mentioned sort of this big sort of late rally in biotech stocks that started in October, and a lot of people, people kind of trying to figure out why that happened. And for some people, what they point to is Elizabeth Warren and kind of the sort of fizzling out of the Medicare for all proposals that were put out there and sort of championed, probably, most strenuously by Elizabeth Warren is then when she sort of started backing away from Medicare for all, that was kind of seen as a signal, to the market that, that it was safe to buy biotech and pharma stocks, and that might have helped trigger the year-end rally that we've seen.
So what are you going to be watching longer term in 2020?
I mean, all of the things that we've mentioned. I would say another thing that I'm kind of interested in is I think that 2020 will be a year where we start getting some of the off-the-shelf cell therapy data. Right now we have many CAR Ts that we talk about approved and that are also in the clinic, kind of nearing approval, that are all, bespoke, made for each individual patient. We have companies like Allogene, Fate Therapeutics, and some others that are developing off-the-shelf cell therapies for oncology. And we're going to start to see some, I think, probably still early, but maybe some more meaningful data from those companies. And I think that will be a very interesting trend to watch going through 2020.
Adam Feuerstein, National Biotech columnist for STAT. Adam, thanks as always.
Daddy, thanks a lot, and happy holidays.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send an email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.